Welcome to the seminar today on divided family issues in North Korea. We have a particularly distinguished panel that's here to participate with us, and we're looking forward to having a good discussion. This summer, we're marking the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. It was a bloody and brutal conflict. The consequences are still very much affect the people who live on the Korean Peninsula. The humanitarian consequences during the war were tremendous, but there continue to be humanitarian consequences that we're going to talk about today. And the push up and down the peninsula with armies going in both directions, the tragic consequence was that many families were separated from loved ones. A lot of it happened in the chaos of conflict, and it's been very difficult for families who for the past 70 years have been separated from their loved ones. One of the problems is that these families continue to remain separated. It's been very difficult for them to work out arrangements between North Korea and South Korea. And the primary culprit has been the North Korean government, which has failed to allow contact between its citizens, and particularly citizens of South Korea or any other place for that matter. And the result is that families that have been divided have largely not been able to see their family, see their loved ones. We have two very distinguished panelists with us today who are going to be talking about this issue. Our first panelist is Soojin Park, who is currently a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Asia program. Ms. Park was deputy spokesperson for the Ministry of Unification from 2011 to 2016. She attended inter-Korean talks seeking to reopen the Kaesong Industrial Complex and to hold reunions of separated family members at Mount Kumgang. Before joining the Ministry of Unification, Ms. Park was a journalist and a host of a program dealing with diplomatic issues on Arirang television. She holds a bachelor's degree from Yonsei University and a master's degree from Purdue. I will introduce Paul Lee after we've heard from Soojin Park. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you for the kind introduction, Ambassador King. Since you've given us a brief introduction, I'll just give a very brief history, an overview of the family reunions that took place. The divided families are among the many painful legacies left by the division of the Korean Peninsula and the ensuing Korean War that has left an open wound for tens of thousands of Koreans who have not been able to reunite or even find out the whereabouts of their loved ones for the past 70 years. The outbreak of the war in 1950 with a surprise attack from the north prompted many Koreans to flee south in search of a safe haven from the mayhem. And those who fled their hometowns in the north thinking they would be able to return once the war was over were never able to do so, with the Iron Curtain only solidifying the division on the Korean Peninsula to this day. Now, with millions of Koreans dislocated in the aftermath of the war and suffering the pangs of family division, addressing this humanitarian issue became extremely important for the government in Seoul. So in 1971, the South Korean Red Cross began fact-finding surveys on divided families. And after over a decade of negotiations with the North, the first ever family reunions materialized in 1985 in the form of exchange hometown group visits between Seoul and Pyongyang. But this pair of exchange visits between families in South and North Korea ended as a one-off with no additional reunions for another 15 years. It was only after the first ever Inter-Korean Summit in 2000 and its June 15 North-South Declaration where the two Korean leaders agreed to exchange visits by separated family members and relatives that formally paved the way for reunion programs to resume and be held on a regular basis. And as many as 5 reunions were held every year from 2000 to 2007 during the Sunshine Policy era of President Kim Dae-jung and his successor, President Roh Moo-hyun. But frequency of reunions dropped notably over the next decade, with deteriorating inter-Korean relations during conservative governments in Seoul. Only 2 rounds of family reunions were held during President Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye's administrations, respectively, in 2009, 2010, and a hiatus of 4 years until 2014 and 2015. And the latest round of family reunions took place in the summer of 2018 after the April 2018 Panmunjom Declaration of the Inter-Korean Summit between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un. So far, a total of 21 in-person family reunions and 7 video reunions have taken place over the past 20 years, which is far too few to accommodate all the applicants seeking a chance to see their loved ones within their lifetime. Now, the procedures and statistics is the Korean National Red Cross, in cooperation with the Ministry of Unification, runs the integrated information system for separated families and manages the reunions. Of the more than 133,000 applicants registered in that system, over 82,000 have already passed away, with the number of survivors standing at about 51,000 as of the end of June this year. In other words, over 60% of the divided families have already passed, and those remaining are also fast running out of time. In fact, over 85% of the survivors are over the age of 70, and those older than 90 years old account for more than a quarter of the total. So they've adopted a family selection process, which is a computer-based lottery that places priority on the elderly and those in search of immediate family members like parents, children, and siblings. In the process of selecting the families for the inter-Korean government-sponsored reunions, the divided families in South Korea were able to learn about the status of some 60,000 relatives in the north, which is, better than nothing. Yet fewer than 5,000 families, or 24,000 individuals in total, have been able to participate in these in-person family reunions held on Korean soil so far. That's roughly 18% of the total applicants. While there have been 7 rounds of video reunions for some 550 families at designated government facilities in the mid-2000s, they've been halted for over a decade now. So when we do the math, an annual average of some 820 individuals were able to meet with their divided families over the past 20 years. At this rate, it would take some 60 years for the remaining applicants to get their turn for a reunion, and that is, the 80-something elderly can survive another 60 years. So what are the main obstacles? As you correctly pointed out, Ambassador King, it's North Korea. Why can't they speed up the process or hold more and bigger family reunions? The biggest obstacle to this resolving this issue is the reluctance on the part of North Korea, which has resulted in intermittent reunions capped at 100 divided families from North and South Korea, respectively, even when they do agree to host family reunions. And why is North Korea holding back? There are a number of reasons North Koreans balk at family reunions. First is North Korea takes a political approach to this fundamentally humanitarian issue. With South Korea surpassing North Korea in almost all aspects, except for nuclear arms, Pyongyang does not have much leverage over Seoul. And well aware that family reunions are among the most important inter-Korean projects sought after by the South, North Korea is not inclined to give away this valued bargaining chip very easily. But I think perhaps just as crucial to North Korea is that is a fear of the South Korean influence seeping in through more regular and direct contact between citizens and their relatives from the South. For example, when we even watch these reunions on TV, the South Korean members of the same family appear much wealthier, freer, and even look younger than their peers in the North, which could make North Korea families question why and become envious of their better off relatives in the South and admire the South Korean ways in comparison. So for these reasons and else more, North Korean authorities not only prep the families with the ideological sessions before the reunions, but also afterwards, so as to drain any capitalistic ideas and influence that they may have come into contact with in the course of participating in these family reunions. What was striking for me when I attended these family reunions in 2014 and 2015 was to notice how the North Korean elderly men came in the same style of suits and hats, as if in uniform, and how many of the women wore traditional Korean dresses that were made of extremely thin material, suitable for the summer season when it was in the cold of the winter. So there's also saying that they even provide gifts for these North Korean residents to give to their relatives so that they don't appear lacking. Now, the future outlook, given such a reluctance and sensitivity on the part of the North Korean regime, family reunions are hosted only if and when Pyongyang feels the need to use them as a leverage to attain their other objectives. And if history is in any indication, family reunions were held most frequently in times of good and active inter-Korean relations, with long breaks or no reunions under icy relations. And that's why it's important to institutionalize family reunions as a humanitarian issue that does not get swayed by political climate or development. Yet, despite the agreement reached during the two inter-Korean summits held in 2018, to continue family reunions and to restore the family reunion center built in Mount Kumgang Resort, execution seems much, much harder in reality, especially when inter-Korean relations are heavily linked to nuclear negotiations and geopolitical conflict of interest in the region. As North Korea has either ignored or refused to resolve this mutual humanitarian issue since the aborted nuclear negotiations with US President Trump in Hanoi in 2019, Seoul's Ministry of Unification earlier this year announced new ways to help the divided families seek private reunions directly with their relatives in the north. That is, by allowing and promoting private family reunions in the form of private tours to the north, Mount Kumgang or Kaesong. But with North Korea closing off its borders at the outbreak of the COVID-19 and only further aggravating the inter-Korean relations through its aggressive rhetoric and action, most recently demonstrated in the explosion of the symbolic North-South Joint Liaison Office in Kaesong, it's really hard to see Pyongyang becoming forthcoming on this humanitarian issue of family reunions in the near future. Well, I don't want to end on a gloomy note, but I would love to see North Korea make a turnaround, but I'll stop here.
We don't want you to end on a gloomy note, but I'm not sure there's much more happiness that we can come up with. Our second panelist is Paul Lee, who's currently Program Assistant for Youth Programs at the U.S. Institute for Peace here in Washington. Previously, he worked in the China and North Korea program at the Institute for Peace, and he's been a junior fellow at the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment. In addition to his professional activity, Paul is also the president of Divided Families USA, an NGO non-government organization that focuses on advocating for Korean Americans who are unable to meet with their relatives in the North. He also co-produces the Divided Family podcast, which gives an opportunity for separated families to tell their stories. Paul's a graduate of Yale, and we're delighted to have him here. When we finish the conversation, when Paul's had an opportunity to make his presentation. We'll have an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions. If you'd like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be happy to include you in the conversation. Paul, we're looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Ambassador King, and to Soojin. It's really an honor to be on this panel with both of you who have been really a living part of this history. And I'm especially grateful to both of you for reviewing and providing feedback on an issue brief that I wrote on the issue of Korean American divided families for the National Committee on North Korea, which I hope can serve as a useful resource on this topic. I just want to preface my remarks by saying that my remarks and what I'm going to say doesn't reflect that of the U.S. Institute of Peace or the U.S. government or any other government. It's just my personal views, and mostly through my experience of Divided Families USA, which, as Ambassador King mentioned, works on advocating for a formal mechanism of family reunions for elderly Korean Americans. I think it's kind of ironic that what I do at my full-time job is regarding youth, and then my volunteer work is regarding very elderly people. But anyways, I wanted to share a quick anecdote because I thought it was very relevant. Just this morning, I received a call from a 86-year-old man in Falls Church, Virginia. Mr. Lee, he is a dual citizen of the U.S. and South Korea. He has his mother, older brother, and younger sister in North Korea. His hometown is in Pyongan, Northern Province in North Korea. And he has lost contact with them. He was able to exchange letters with them until the early 2000s, but he hasn't heard of them since 2003. And he contacted me saying that, one, he still has hope and wants and has a desire to find out what happened to his family members in North Korea. And two, he wants to share his story so that even after he passes away, other people, other generations will know about his story. But three, he mentioned health concerns and political concerns as well, that he might not be able to travel to North Korea, even if there was a reunion program. Now, I'm sharing this story because I think it's very relevant to what I'm about to share with you all. And I hope I can give you three takeaways from my remarks. The first is that I think Soojin gave a very comprehensive overview of Korean divided families. But the first point I'd like to make is that for some reason, many people know about Korean divided families, but very few people think about this as an American issue. Not just one that the U.S. has at stake, but one that involves American citizens, including veterans, including other public servants. The second point I'd like to make in my remarks is we all know that Korean divided families are a very tragic issue. And there are other Korean divided families as well, including more recent North Korean defectors, adoptees, Zainichi Koreans in Japan who are repatriated, abductees. But I want to focus on takeaways from lessons from the past. And I would love to ask some questions to Ambassador King as well, because he has been such a champion of this issue while he was the special envoy. And finally, I would like to challenge everyone and encourage you all to think critically about the current mechanism we have for family reunions with North Korea. Given recent developments, especially with the pandemic, it seems that face-to-face reunions, again, as Soojin mentioned and as the South Korean government acknowledges, might not be the most efficient or effective way at achieving closure, which is something that I would like to end on. So I'm going to share a graph here with the list of ages of the 98 individuals. These are elderly Korean Americans who have registered on Divided Families USA, our private organization's registry. So as you can see, these are all individuals. They're spread out all over the United States, mostly in major metropolitan areas. So the LA area, New York, New Jersey, DC, and Seattle as well are some of the main areas. And as you can see from this graph, it really mirrors the South Korean divided family population. I believe the average age of the South Korean divided families is about 81 or 82, and you can see that it's probably even greater in the Korean American case. I think the point that I would like to illustrate here in terms of giving an overview of Korean American divided families is the sheer difficulty of accounting for Korean American divided families. So unlike South Korea, which keeps very robust statistics through the Ministry of Unification on both the ages, on the whereabouts, on both formal and informal reunion efforts, there's close to no information about Korean American divided families. And I think there are two main reasons for this, of the difficulty of accounting for them. The first is, as I mentioned, there hasn't been a systematic whole of government or comprehensive effort to trace Korean American divided families. But on the other hand, there's also a great amount of shame and distrust and cultural and language barriers for a lot of these elderly Korean American divided families that have deterred them from coming out of the shadows and saying, I'm a Korean American divided family member. So we see the number 100,000 being thrown around a lot. As we can see from what Soojin mentioned, over 60% of those registered on South Korea's registry have already passed away. And just the 98 people on Divided Family USA's private registry, they're quickly passing away as well. I think it's clear that time is running out for these Korean American divided families. I think a key statistic to mention here, though, is that we can understand Korean American divided families, I think, from South Korea's statistics. So from a 2018 survey, what really struck me about a government survey from 2018 in South Korea, which showed that 92% of divided family members in South Korea expressed a desire to know what happened to the relatives in North Korea, while 75% expressed interest in participating in a reunion program in North Korea. What makes the issue of Korean American divided families distinct is that there has not been an official channel for face-to-face reunions, but also for reconnecting with their families in North Korea. What I'll talk about now is briefly walk us through some of the grassroots activism and past efforts at reunions, most of which have not ended in a success, unfortunately, but I hope that we can glean some takeaways and some opportunities for moving forward, especially given that there are some rumors of the Trump administration looking to have a breakthrough on a summit level with North Korea later this year. As I mentioned, Korean Americans have not had an official pathway for reunions, unlike South Korean citizens. So they've had to resort to two primary ways to try to reunite with their families. The first one has been with the North Korean government through informal ways. So there is a North Korean Workers' Party agency called the Association for Overseas Compatriots, which has a connection with a organization in the United States called the Korean American National Coordinating Council, KNCC. And over the past several decades, along with the DPRK mission to the United Nations in New York, which has served as a de facto diplomatic office, some Korean Americans have been able to connect and reunite with their family members. The other method has been through third-party brokers, either ethnic Korean Chinese or Joseonjok, or through brokers in other countries such as Canada. As I mentioned before, though, given the shame and a lot of the Cold War mentality and ideology that a lot of these elderly Korean American divided family members have, many of them have been very loath to engage with these either brokers or North Korean government organizations. One, because of the political values, but two, because of the unpredictability and the unreliability. I do think, though, that since the early 2000s, there has been a strong level of US governmental and grassroots support for US North Korea family reunions. We've seen this in the North Korean Human Rights Act of 2004 and when it was renewed. We've seen this in language about Korean American divided families in the National Defense Authorization Act, in the State Foreign Operations and Related Programs. We've seen this in most recently in two pieces of legislation which passed the House of Representatives in March of this year. The Divided Families Reunification Act, introduced by Representative Grace Meng, and HR 410, introduced by Representative Karen Bass. I do want to point out, though, that the Divided Families Reunification Act, which directs the U.S. government to work with the South Korean government on including Korean Americans reunions, and directs the Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights to report on this issue. This position, unfortunately, has been vacant since Ambassador King was in the position, so your presence is sorely missed. I want to point out here that both, I think Soojin correctly pointed out that the North Korean government has been a primary challenge, presented obstacles in making reunions a reality. But North Korean governments and the officials have expressed interest in the past. It's just that the two sides have rarely aligned at the same time. Perhaps Ambassador King would know because you were intimately involved in these negotiations while you were in the position, but there were instances such as in 2011 when the two sides were very close to making reunions a reality. But again, the issue with US North Korea family reunions is that there is also a lack of a reliable interlocutor. For example, the American Red Cross has been an organization that has been expressed interest in helping, but they don't have the budget or the resources or the mandate to really serve as a reliable interlocutor for family reunions. The last thing I would like to say is 70 years after the outbreak of the Korean War, what can we do now? And it's almost a given that we think that reuniting these families is something that we must do. But in some ways, I would just like to push back on this fact a little bit because there have been studies, particularly by one scholar named James Foley, who has written an English language book on Korea's divided families, that this system of one-off, one-time reunions with minders from North Korea, with cameras from the media flashing everywhere from several different countries, might actually be counterproductive in achieving closure for divided families. So especially given the health risk concerned with face-to-face reunions, I want to keep pushing forward the government-to-government mechanisms of reunions. But I also want to encourage all the listeners here, I think, who come from various sectors, to think creatively about what we can do to provide closure for these divided families. And I think no matter what field you're in, from foreign policy to grassroots activism to the media, I think there's plenty of things that we can do to support these divided families, including studies of accounting for Korean American divided families, recording their stories in creative ways, and actually disseminating or sharing their information through radio programs or through other means to reach their relatives in North Korea. So I'm looking forward to the questions and the rest of the discussion.
Thanks very much to both of our panelists. Again, I'd like to remind the audience that if you have questions that you'd like to pose to these two very well-informed people, they're more than happy to tackle some of your questions. One question that I'd like to ask, we've talked about this being an issue of the elderly, and it's a rapidly declining problem because these people are elderly, they're dying, they're not able to travel. Is there any interest on the part of younger family members who may not have been alive at the time families were separated during the Korean War, but who have an interest in their family and who their relatives are in North Korea? And I would assume that some of those in North Korea would be interested to know what has happened to their families in South Korea. Is there any interest or any indication of including second generation members of divided families in meetings?
Well, I'll take that answer from the South Korean perspective. I have not had any had to look at a specific survey with the statistics on that particular topic, but generally speaking, the interest has waned very much every year, over the years, and by the year, I think, with as you said, the first generation of the divided families passing away. The younger generation are less interested, so I think there's not much of a drive or engine to pursue this the separated family reunions as much as in the past decades when the government felt a kind of pressure to do so. But having said that, I do think having attended some of these sessions accompanied by these very young generations, because these elderlies needed assistance to move. There were some in their 20s as well who accompanied their grandfathers or grandmothers. And it was an eye-opening experience for these younger generations to just see for themselves the sorrow and the reality and experience it. So I think it's important to make people, if not directly, at least indirectly, realize how dire humanitarian issue this is. And it's important, like Paul mentioned, to provide this kind of closure for these people in their lifetimes.
Yeah, if I could quickly add on to that question, I think from a US perspective, it's even more difficult. I think there's definitely a high level of interest among younger Korean Americans. But in terms of actually joining the reunions, if there ever was one, I think the language barrier, the fact that most Korean Americans from the younger generation are not able to converse in Korean with their grandparents, I think that also presents a barrier.
There are a couple of questions from some of our audience that I'd like to pose. Maybe we can look at some of those. Terrence Matsuo said, are these barriers to bringing families together beneath the level of, are there ways to bring families together beneath the level of in-person meetings? How integrated is North Korea in the international postal system? While there are security concerns, would a Korean Peninsula white pages be helpful in promoting communication between families separated by the DMZ? Does one of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I'm too young to know what familiar with the white pages, but I do. The divided family member that I mentioned that I spoke to this morning, Mr. Lee, he had mentioned that he was just able to send cards, letters to North Korea until the early 2000s. And I guess he just stamped it in international mail, and it was allowed to reach North Korea. I guess I'm not sure if the ban on restriction on U.S. passports into actually traveling to North Korea since September 2017 has something to do with mail, but I think he made it clear that now it's very difficult for him, for members of civil society, to actually send mail from the U.S. into North Korea.
I know about the Korean side that it is not possible for South Korean citizens to use the postal system to send mail to North Korea because officially it's not integrated, and there is still, although there are many issues or controversy over the national security law in Korea, it's technically not allowed to communicate with the North Koreans without the permission of the Korean government.
In-person meetings in some ways are easier to deal with. The North Koreans are happier in some ways, I think, because they can monitor more carefully what's going on, because those meetings have all taken place in North Korea and they've been carefully monitored when they've occurred. Let's go, there's another question or two here. A question about contact was mentioned between persons outside the DPRK and those inside. What was the modality of the correspondence? This is following up basically on some of the same questions we've talked about before. And basically, it's very difficult corresponding by mail. And that makes it very much a problem. Another question here. If an if a Korean American would like to join the informal channel that's connected with North Korea, what are the steps? Is there a way of doing that? Paul, do you want to start on that one and give us some of your experience about what families have been able to do?
Sure. As I mentioned, Korean Americans have been able to liaise with organizations like the Korean American National Coordinating Council, which I believe is still active according to a recent source, and they apparently still receive I think 20 to 30 applications a year to reunite with their family members in North Korea. And again, according to the source, it costs about $300 to actually pay this organization and try to make the link. Unfortunately, the success rate, I think, has been dismal. I think around 10% of this organization able to trace and reconnect with families in North Korea.
Do you have anything you want to add, Soojin? Flip on your mute or flip off the mute.
Oh, I think I don't really have much to say on the Korean American trying to because I don't have as much knowledge on that back part. Yeah.
Thanks. Alexa Student asks, my question is simple. During the pandemic, is it not imperative for us to work collectively to have the UN highlight the need for global humanitarian overtures to North Korea, beginning with provisions of PPEs and COVID-related materials, and then heading to face-to-face meetings for those who would like to meet both from South and from the US? What might be the best group at the UN or private group to help facilitate this? The Harvard-based health workers, the Eugene Bell Foundation. Any thoughts on the pandemic in connection with what's going on here?
Yeah, Professor Dunn, I totally agree. I think more should be done. I'm wondering as well about the best third-party organization to facilitate this kind of exchange or humanitarian support, because what I've noticed is that divided families, family reunions, oftentimes the North Korea watchers in camp are split into the engagement camp and the sanctions or human rights camp. But in my experience, family reunions should be just a total human issue that shouldn't be swayed by politics. The Eugene Bell Foundation, through a subset of the organization called the Hemsworthy Project, did work on this issue of divided families in the 2000s, but I believe they're not so active anymore. And the special rapporteur, the current special rapporteur for North Korean human rights, Thomas Quintana, he has also expressed strong interest in the divided families issue and has met with Korean American divided families last year. But in terms of actually being able to facilitate the reunions, same thing with the American Red Cross and the International Committee of the Red Cross. I think it will really take a green light or a strong showing of initiative from the US government for NGOs and other organizations to really hop on and do substantial work in facilitating these reunions.
I agree with Paul completely that even though there is much interest among the grassroots and the civic groups on this topic, when it involves North Korea, for things to get done, to materialize, the government needs to take the initiative to at least initiate, because there's only so much these groups can do despite their fervor and all their efforts. Unless the government can take the initiative to help them push this drive at a level that North Korean authorities kind of grant or support for whatever reason, it's really hard to get beyond any kind of a result.
Good. Sandra Fahey asked, as survivors of the Holocaust aged, there was a huge push to record as many survivor testimonies as possible. How could we motivate Americans and Korean Americans to create a similar oral and visual archive recording survivor testimonials of divided families in the USA and South Korea? Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, Dr. Fahey, I am so glad you asked this question because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. As Ambassador King mentioned, recently I've been working on a podcast that features different stories of family separation. And recently I interviewed a researcher from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And I was just amazed at the wealth of resources and stories that they have on the Holocaust, not just from the US, but from all over the world. And I think it's just a tremendous amount of resources, effort, bandwidth that has been spent on tracing and reconnecting these families, even after they have passed away. It would be amazing to have a counterpart to something like that for the Korean diaspora or Korean divided families. I think this is where members from other sectors and other fields like media or other parts of civil society can come in, whether they're Korean American or not. I think just in terms of messaging, I think what really hits home for me is that in my eyes, these Korean American elderly divided family members are in some ways the last surviving, or one of the last surviving human links between the US and North Korea. You have the prisoner of war remains, you have a small number of North Korean defectors in the US, but by and large, in terms of the human face of the link between the US and North Korea, these elderly people are what I see. So if anybody else is interested in working on such a registry or oral history project, please contact me.
On the part, I mean, I really hope that can be initiated because I agree it's very important for so many reasons. And in South Korea, actually, there is a project that is an ongoing project to have the recorded video messages of the survivors who have not yet reunited with their divided families, yet want to, even if they pass away, leave something should the other member have a chance. So they've already have over 22,000 recorded video messages of these separated families in South Korea that have yet to be delivered to North Korean families. And also they have this project to preserve the DNAs that even if, like the Holocaust, the project, for our the people to remember this history, and also the descendants to locate their family tree.
Very good. One of the things that helped with the collection of Holocaust survivor testimonies was a very active effort by Steven Spielberg, who created the Shoah Foundation, was heavily involved in an effort to gather these kind of testimonies. And they produced a very interesting film, The Last Days, which focused on stories of a series of Hungarian Holocaust survivors. And they interviewed them fairly extensively and produced an extremely good one of the Oscar awards for documentaries the year it was produced. What we need to do is find some of these brilliant South Korean media people to focus on this issue and see if we can't do the same thing there. Diana Lady Dugan would like to ask a question. Diana, do you want to give us your question? Is there a way that we can get you on the screen? Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, if you can't see me, that's all right. Ironically, the question that I was going to pose was sort of picked up by someone else. By way of background, I served for a number of years as a United States ambassador and administratively assistant secretary of state and other things in government, mostly dealing with technology and information technology. But I may be the only person in the whole Zoom room who was actually in Seoul when the Korean War started and remember it. So I am older than a boulder. And in fact, I have the honor of being an honorary Korean citizen, not for anything that I did, but because of work my family did on behalf of Korea during the Japanese occupation, including my grandfather drafting the constitution for the government in exile that was in Shanghai and LA. So I have a very deep attachment to it. But I would really wanted to pick up on, well, what can we do now that instead of trying to make what may not happen, I was curious that I had thought about something like a story corps, and it sounds like there is a bit of one in South Korea. And I think there's also another factor here, and that is in general, and I have not been back to Korea in a number of years, but I know it's not the Korea I grew up in. And the next generation in many countries have lost their interest and respect, much less understanding of their parents, much less grandparents. So I guess I would encourage, in fact, I would be very happy to learn more about it and be helpful in something that would start systematically with some Korean Americans and who are still alive, and start with ones that are older, and have an actual more formalized program that also can be appreciated in the South as well, and be able to at least not lose the perspective that so many of these people have. And unfortunately, like you, many of the older Koreans I knew and loved and respected are long dead now. But I really would encourage to try and do that. I will not facetiously say and get balloons and pass these stories or videos on to the North for obvious reasons. But if you don't do something, regardless of the barriers, and do it more expeditiously now. I have a good Korean friend whose family is from North Korea, who was my brother's best friend before the war in school, and he's doing a autobiography on his family in North Korea. And he's found amazing things. And I don't know how much and how he's been able to do a lot of piecing that together. But anyway, I just leave you more with the message rather than a question. And that is, first of all, applause to you all for what you are doing. And it's also important beyond Korean heritage, it's important to everyone better understanding how the world was, especially in a time now when everyone's suddenly saying, gee, things aren't always going to be the same. And the smugness that societies have developed, and particularly rested upon the next generation. I think you can do something compelling that would be a model for a number of people, but particularly Korea, because of the basically very homogenized and family-oriented culture. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diana, for your comment. And thanks for your very personal insight into what was going on at the time you were there. The last question that we have from one of the attendees says, which factor do you think has the greater responsibility for the postponed reunion of the divided families? The United States or South Korean efforts, or the North Korean attitude? What's your sense in terms of, doesn't do a lot of good to place blame, but maybe we can explain why there are problems and where the problems are in that regard. Do you want to go ahead, Soojin, and give us your thoughts?
Well, like you said, I don't want to put a blame on, one particular actor, because like the saying goes, you can't, make a sound, you can't clap with only one hand, right? So all involved parties are at fault, I think, for failing to help these, separated, divided families to reunite, at least for once, in their lifetime. But I don't want to sound too sided, but for this to happen, I think it's North Korea that has the key, because it's a very isolated, secluded state that the citizens do not have access, and the residents don't have access to the outside world, even the internet. Of course, they have like illegal access, but usually it's only to China. So the key is in North Korea's hands. And although I cannot agree with their ideas, since they have the keys, I think we need to work with them to make this happen without sacrificing too much on our principles, but yet compromising in some ways to help this materialize.
Very good. Thank you very much. Paul, would you like to add a closing comment here?
Yeah, I think what I would like to close with as well is that this divided families and family reunions are in theory something that, in principle, something that the North Korean government supports as well. And there shouldn't be, in diplomatic terms, family reunion should be the low-hanging fruit, because there's, in my eyes, these elderly divided families shouldn't pose a risk for defection or for any other political or physical threat to the legitimacy or the stability of the North Korean government. So I think, I don't want to point fingers as well, but I would say that to continue to push this issue forward with the North Korean government and with North Korean officials, and show them that this is a way that the North Korean government can demonstrate to the international community to build trust, to show that maybe in a small way they do care about their own people. So I think that's how I would phrase this issue. And again, I think the North Korean government too knows that time is running out, and I don't even know if in 10 years many of these divided family members, either in South Korea or the US, probably the number is much fewer in North Korea, will even be alive. So I think it should be an issue that the North Korean government, and it is an issue that the North Korean government is considering as well. I would just like to again make the point that we should think carefully about the system of family reunions that have been in place and focus on, one, ascertaining the status of relatives in North Korea, and two, establishing some form of connection and communication, whether it's video calls, letter exchanges, so that there is continued opportunity for closure between the divided families.
Thanks very much. I think we've had a very interesting discussion today and covered a wide variety of issues. It's a complicated one, and the difficulty that strikes me is that both the United States and the South Korean governments are primarily engaged in trying to arrange for families to get together because of the humanitarian interest and concern on the part of their citizens. North Korea, on the other hand, has far less concern about the individuals in North Korea. And I think the real problem is that North Korea wants to be able to use access to their own citizens by their relatives to get something from South Korea or from the United States. And that's, I think, where the problem is, because this is really a humanitarian problem. It's not a political problem. These are people who should be allowed to see their family, to meet with relatives. It's the kind of thing that in most countries, people recognize it immediately as having value. Thanks so much for the discussion. It's been very interesting. I appreciate our panelists. You can give them applause. We won't hear it, but we thank them for their efforts and wish them success as they continue what they've been doing. Thanks very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on another KEI webinar. Thanks.